One night, I dreamt of mud oozing from my ears. I'm lying prostrate on my belly in the dream with my eyes closed, and there's a weird and dolorous melody meandering in the background. It's an experience of something like musical listening, but the myriad thresholds that entail in such listening are all slightly awry. For instance, that of the sound-non-sound threshold that, as the phonocleric argues, produces and is produced by the technology of musical listening. That is, there's a symbolic affordance of sound's organization such that listening directs us towards sonic activity that is, quote, felt in sound as a quality of aliveness or abstraction of feeling, where what is felt are abstractions and what is felt abstractly are thoughts. So thought is an abstraction felt abstractly, and the phonocleric argues that there's a similar kind of redoubled abstraction in musical listening, because music produces not just abstractions, but specifically abstractions of feeling, which is to say abstractions of abstractions. So the point is, what's felt in music is, as the phonocleric puts it, non-sound, an extra sonorous semblance of aliveness that appears in sound through a technical mode of listening. Now, our plaintive priest is sermonizing on the topic of music in this case, but I would argue that this reasoning is constitutive of listening in general, insofar as we understand listening as a kind of operation that's catalyzed by sounds, but that isn't coextensive with them. So I think music is a rhetorical rather than ontological term in the phonocleric's cult, and one that specifically functions to articulate sound in its technological aspect. It helps us to understand what sound's organization produces. With my ears crammed full of sludge, though, this extra sonorous, non-sonic sound that comes with listening takes hold in a different way. If musical listening points to a threshold between sound and non-sound at the level of production, listening with slime slopping about in my ears is a kind of listening where production and reception are no longer even provisionally separable. This isn't dissimilar from Stephen Connor's really beautifully written account of tinnitus, where in channeling Serres he remarks that in tinnitus it's somehow as if he were intercepting his own hearing processes, listening in on the work of his own ears. This amounts, for Connor, to a kind of auto-interceptive listening, where the intra-hearing feedback loop is characterized as an informational black box, as many of you know, and that we know what goes in and what comes out, but we, quote, don't know precisely what happens in the middle. And moreover, since it's auto-interceptive, I think it might be more accurate to say that we know there are transformative comings and goings, and we know something like what is involved in these, but we don't know the direction of the transformations, nor specifically what they entail. And indeed, these otoacoustic emissions, these sounds that are produced by the ear and that interact with the outside world, but which are not of either, these are not exclusive to listeners living with tinnitus, of course, but are instead a constitutive component of listening in general that's made explicit in the case of tinnitus. My experience, then, is a kind of mucilage-inflected hearing that's intensified along a tinnital vector. Put simply, my auralneiric muddiness defies being diagrammed according to its signals, senders, and receivers. The mud is at once the source of my partial deafness and an amplifier of the sounds of my listening. And noticing this, I briefly drift into consciousness, seduced by the palindromic palpations of a clock bleeding 2:22, presumably AM. Lying still in bed, my ears seeping, I realize that the metaphor of a threshold in the sound-non-sound relation that the phonocleric describes is replaced in my experience by that of a texture, where the suffix ure indicates, in a kind of apocryphal etymology, something that results from, and where text in this instance traces its etymology to weaving. Texture, then, stands in for a qualitative shift like that of a mixture, where the component parts are no longer separable, irreversible. The difference in this instance, of course, lies in the fact that a sonic texture's component parts, if we're accepting sound and non-sound as these, aren't found anywhere else. So in this formulation, what we're discussing is a texturing of effects rather than an object, a texturing specifically of the real material effects of an ideal object, or, put more nicely, a texturing of a vector, which is a queer sort of mixture. To be clear, I'm not in any way contradicting the phonocleric, to whom I remain a loyal savant. I am, though, revalencing his analysis towards a different point of emphasis. and specifically my muddy dream emphasizes, to my ears, a position outside of the individual listener. This is a little ironic because it's such an intensely personal and subjective experience in every sense, but it's nonetheless the case, I think, because it calls me to hear listening as occurring in a space that's always already full, a space that's brimming over like an incoming tide, not just obscuring the shoreline, but in fact redrawing it. To put it schematically, which we should never do, if listening as texture indelibly mixes the productive and receptive vectors of listening by conceiving the space of the listening apparatus, in my case, my muddy ears, by conceiving that space as full to the point of overflowing, and if this means that the otoacoustic dimension of listening is emphasized, then all that's necessary if we want to extend this framework beyond the individual listener is to conceive of the listening apparatus more broadly, to follow the muddy flow, like so many blues musicians before us. The reference already seems dated, but we might say that this is a shift from thinking about sounds as a movement into us towards thinking of them as occupying us. A movement, after all, aims for internal consistency, but uses space, as Wark puts it, just as a place to park its ranks, whereas an occupation, still tracking Wark, has no internal consistency, but chooses meaningful spaces that have significant resonance into the abstract terrain of symbolic geography. That is, sound particularizes in individual bodies such that it occupies the abstract space through which those bodies relate, which is to say, the space through which they become bodies in the first place. Sound makes no demands except to be heard. Or, put differently, there's what one might call a primary relationality to listening that suggests the black box not just as a problem for communication, but in fact as the problematic form of communication itself. This is listening to communication as non-communication, which is also to suggest, weirdly, for me reluctantly, a kind of arched listening. Or perhaps not, because this is, after all, in all likelihood, a dream I'm discussing, and if nothing else, we've learned that a dream is never about exactly what it seems, precisely because the separation that's implicit in the word about precludes such imminence. The thought of this separation hits me, and I briefly jolt awake, rattled by the palindromic clamor of a clock jangling 3:33, presumably AM. Lying still though tensely, I'm resolutely not making a claim about what sound or listening is. I'm simply experiencing a way in which sound's texture and capacity mobilizes a specific form of networking, a specific way of thinking relations. I'm not motivated in this particular present tense situation from my auralneiric past, but I am, as I sit here now before you, because I think it moves in the direction of engaging one of the substantial challenges of our time and place, a challenge that Anna Munster terms network anesthesia. In this, Munster's taking note, like others have, of the prominence that the nodes and edges style diagram has gained in describing relations in our era of computer network technologies. With the phrase network anesthesia, then, Munster names a, quote, numbing of our perception that turns us away from network's unevenness and from the varying qualities of their relationality. So put simply, virtually every image of a network that we have is a variation of the nodes and edges form, and this form of diagram occludes the specifics of the relations it represents in favor of a generalized notion of interaction. It's of course no accident that this comes to prominence in the context of late global capitalism. So as Munster puts it, what we have lost is the experience of the edges, the experience of relation. And she goes on to cite William James to insist in a register resonant with the phonocheric cabal that the relations that connect experiences must themselves be experienced relations. If, as Wark argues, any social form resides within a communication infrastructure that gives it a certain shape, a certain tempo that renders the infrastructure at least somewhat invisible, Munster's point is simply, I think, that this problem is intensified in contemporary technoculture. That is, this is particularly the case when, as Mark Hansen suggests, for perhaps the first time in history, media no longer mediate just a sensory experience that precedes the medium, like, say, an image, but actually mediate something like the medium itself, which is to say the connectivity that comes with our massively distributed extrasensory technical infrastructure. For the argument I'm trying to incant while I dream, before its inevitable recantation, it's important to note that the problem of network anesthesia highlights a technical conception of relation, not only in the computational sense, but also, and probably more so, in the representational frameworks that subtend visualization technologies and the graph theories with which these commingle. As Munster puts it so eloquently, the shift from hierarchical to relational data, this is the shift that characterizes the shift from the internet as a kind of encyclopedia to the internet as a kind of interactive framework. This shift is tied into the development of a general network dispositif that's coextensive with an entire social field of the network. So it follows that network anesthesia is tied up in the affordances and constraints of specific methods of data visualization, and indeed I expect in visualization itself as a method, since every visualization is at once dependent on its method of excluding and prioritizing data, and simultaneously and constitutively incapable of representing what's excluded or de-emphasized in this method within its representational framework. Picturing this problem, I briefly prickle awake, itched by the palindromic irritant of a clock scratching 4:44, presumably a.m. Lying less still, fidgeting, I can begin to hear how specifically sonic texturing might approach this problem. Rather than supplementing the relational anesthesia of data visualization with sonification, which is really just a different experience of the same framework, sonic texturing might work by revalencing established and mature conversations about sound and relations. In this, I have in mind the phonochasmic and collapsing activities that Monsieur Redbreast emphasizes in the arrayed microphone experiments undertaken by Glenn Gould in the mid-70s. In essence, the term phonochasm describes the severing of a, quote, subject from its acoustical milieu, delivering it into the schizophonic chaos through a judicious control of reverberation. Gould's experiments in this direction involved, as Redbreast describes, the alignment of an array of microphone pairs extending from the interior of the piano to the back of the hall, allowing for a kind of cinematic zooming away from and into the musical object of attention, and constant shuttling between an intimate closeness devoid of context to an overpowering of the putative signal by its resonant effects, as he puts it. In short, schizophrenia describes the psychic condition that arises from a culture wherein sounds are consistently separated from their sources, and that being the case, phonochasms then are the material conditions that execute this. Phonocollapses, then, are in one sense antipodal to phonochasms on the phonic continuum, describing a condition of an undifferentiated whole. An object case, for example, might be audio recorded on a Ferguson protester's mobile phone, which I recently heard, in the chaotic scramble to an undefined and undesignated safe location whilst under a hail of the police's rubber bullets. So the constitutive noisiness of such recordings is, of course, not anti-informational, as noise never is, but rather precisely informative of a certain context, a context that when pushed to its extreme, as in the case described, reverses into something like a wild immanence of context collapsing into itself. Now, D.J. Zenadiel emphasizes the reverberative conditions of this continuum, calling for robust reverb management, both as a recording technique and, more importantly, as a political technique that can include reinjections of reverb in order to promote particularly fertile political vectors. But reverberation is by no means the only technique for moving along the phonochasmic collapsing continuum, and we have analogous effects with different potentials available through the use of lags, glitches, replacements, frequency attenuations, and amplifications, and through relative emphasis on sound in relation to the other senses. With respect to the latter, for example, with respect to the relative emphasis on sound in relation to the other senses, Garth Payne recently described to me his use of the Oculus Rift headset to pair panoramic images of natural locations with ambisonic audio of the same. Ambisonic audio consists of basically a kind of panoramic or spherical recording that's responsive to the movement of the listener's head during playback. So what was remarkable to Garth and to me is that people testing this system, this pairing of image and ambisonic sound, including people with lots of experience in VR systems, invariably, literally without exception, perceive the panoramic still photos to be responsive videos. So a leap from a representational interaction to a simulative one is made through a phonocollapse aimed at the visual component of the experience. The suturing or bootstrapping of the audio to the contingent movements of the listener's head, many of which movements are autonomic, of course, unhinges the status of the visual interaction. It should be noted that this is different than what Mitchell calls braiding, although it follows from it. That is, if braiding names the phenomenon when, quote, one sensory channel or semiotic function is woven together with another more or less seamlessly, the texture of this specific braid is radically singular. The wonder of the pairing doesn't, at least to my ears, so much lie in the multimediality of the experience, but rather in the way that the particular collapse specifies this conjunction such that its medial contexts are no longer independently decipherable. My dream, then, is that approaching sound momentarily, contingently, in its texturing capacity allows us to think such phonochasms and collapses in their relationality rather than as statements about the positions of sending and receiving bodies, or even, for that matter, as statements about ontological orders such as representation versus simulation. Because the texture of the panoramic photo with ambisonic sound is not simulational as opposed to representational, but rather it rubs my muddy ears as a kind of incipient simulationality that's in the lived network that constitutes any representational framework. I'm half awake under the palindromic fleer of a clock's 5:55 gaze, presumably AM. And so I try to capture this dream with a simple, annoyingly literal example. I know again from Garth Payne of a project that explores remote embodied landscapes of UNESCO biosphere reserves through sound. That's their website. The project consists, in essence, in a series of sound recordings made in biosphere reserves that are accessible through a website. And one goal, amongst many, many, many goals, is to make some of these recordings, map them to GPS coordinates, and then allow these coordinates to in turn be superimposed onto a remote listener's physical location using their smartphone. So, for example, while out for an evening walk in Toronto, I could listen to a section of the Mojave Desert that corresponds in size to the actual distance that I'm walking. And of course, if something catches my ear, I can adjust my course and walk towards it. Now, there are lots of the aspects of this project that I find thought-provoking as I lie awake in bed, distracted by the palindromically incessant 6:66, presumably AM, of the clock next to me. However, what captures me that day, because of its captivating literalness, is the relatively novel networking that this UNESCO project performs in its particular approach to a simple technical problem. The simple problem, put simply, is in developing a way to move between various ambisonic sound samples without any audible cuts, because a kind of more conventional approach of simply cross-fading volumes would introduce a bizarre multi-perspectivalism into the ambisonic recordings, which, while sounding absolutely awesome, would puncture the integrity of their virtual layer. Now, one approach to this problem is to use frequency analysis towards stitching together a composite One approach to this problem is to use frequency analysis towards stitching together a composite, partially synthetic network that responds in what we come to call real time to the listener's movements. The point, in the context of my extrapolated auralneiric experience, is that this network is literally inconceivable within a static nodes and edges model, because the connecting edges are, in a weird computational time warp, synthesized as much as they are uncovered. So it's not just that a user's experience of the network is particularized because they've chosen their own path through the sonic territory. It's also, and more so, that the sonic territory itself is produced by the relations uncovered by the user's pathways. The experience is as much of the putative relations as it is of the biosphere location that serves as an authenticating alibi. As I said, this is an annoyingly literal example, and I can't really hold my attention away from the eldritch, red-breasted palindromic moan of the clock next to me, flickering 7:77, presumably a.m. But if I could attend to the mud in my ears' qualities, its specific productions, amplifications, and attenuations, rather than just understanding it as a signal inhibitor in my hearing process, if I could, that is, develop anesthesia of networks by attending to relations in their own right, if I could do that, then a significant challenge nonetheless remains in how to make this attention resonant. My wager, in retrospect, is that this phonochasmic collapse continuum, palpated in its extra reverberative dimensions, might have provided one means of my having done so. It's not the cleanest theoretical approach, and indeed, it's more of a theoretical anamnesis than an approach at all, but it nonetheless continues to bubble in my auralneiric sludge mind. Thank you.